Hello, everybody. I'm delighted and honored to convene this panel on decolonizing cultural management policies and practices. Traditionally, research and practices in the field have been limited to Western and Anglophone contexts. Recognizing this, our panel seeks to critically examine the origin and knowledge systems of the field. It argues for a broader perspectives and advocates for the inclusion of diverse research contexts, methodologies, and theoretical foundations. This wider approach would lead to arts management practices and policies that are more sensitive and responsive to the cultural, linguistic, ethnic, and racial backgrounds of arts managers working globally, particularly those outside of the Western world. So our panel features today 4 research papers that explore the decolonizations of cultural management and policies from really different angles and really different perspectives. So after my paper, we will have Sunita Janamahanan, who will talk about anti-capitalist and decolonized models of arts and cultural work in Southeast Asia. Followed by this paper, there will be a presentation by Michelle Lohr with their paper titled From Racial Categories to Multiculturalism, Decolonizing Cultural Policy in Singapore. And finally, Jason Vittarillo will conclude the panel with his research on recontextualization and decentralization of cultural participations in the Philippines. So, my presentation titled Decolonizing Cultural Diplomacy as an Academic Discipline. And I'm opening this panel with my research, which has a more global scope and focus of research. Then, and after that, after this more broad perspective, I will give the floor to other panelists who will explore the practices and issues of decolonization from Southeast perspectives, featuring such countries as Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines. So, in my research, I look at the academic discipline of cultural diplomacy that was first coined and defined only in the second part of the 20th century in the midst of the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Russia. The earliest use of the term cultural diplomacy in English texts was spotted in 1954 in New York Times piece by an art critic. But cultural diplomacy was first defined only in 1959 by the United States Department of State as the direct and enduring contact between people of different nations to help create a better climate of international trust and understanding in which official relationships can operate. Since then, cultural diplomacy as an object of study was marked as a product of academia originating from the Cold War. And by the 1970s, cultural diplomacy has become a label that had gained international recognition, finally entering the common parlance in other countries, especially beyond the Western world, only in the 1990s. In my most recent research, I challenged myself to explore the whole body of academic scholarship produced from 1959. I wanted to reveal what specific issues and questions cultural diplomacy scholars covered in their academic research in the past to identify and discuss the most critical research trajectories for the development of the discipline in the future. So to address this task, I explored the Scopus database, the largest curated bibliographic abstract and citation database in the world. And as you can see on the screen, some statistics on that. And the body of relevant data on cultural diplomacy scholarship was collected by mining the repository textual data using just one keyword or phrase, which is cultural diplomacy. I collected information on all publications in the English language which contain this research term, either in the abstract or in the publication's keywords. So my search resulted in 1,663 items. Employ mapping, chronology building, and focused content analysis of all publications data, as well as the thematic analysis of selected articles, I developed a comprehensive account of cultural diplomacy scholarship, identifying thematic and geographic coverage gaps to propose the future development of the research area. So, putting all existing scholarship in the timeline first, I revealed that only a small portion of all existing scholarship on cultural diplomacy was produced before 2010. Actually, exactly the time when I came into the field with my first article on cultural diplomacy. So, more importantly, only recently the academic field of cultural diplomacy has become the most fruitful, with around 200 pieces published in every year in the past years. So, the thematic analysis of abstracts also indicated that almost half of the research is based on the historical analysis of cases, sometimes even dating back to 6th or 7th century. Furthermore, I mapped geographical data pertaining to cultural diplomacy scholars' university affiliations to identify areas on the global map where cultural diplomacy literature is mostly produced. The results of this mapping demonstrated a high density of publications on cultural diplomacy originating in such countries as the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, with lesser but still significant outputs coming from Russia, Canada, and China, as well as from a very few European countries. If we look at Central and Eastern Europe, for example, we can see that there are only a few academic publications of cultural diplomacy that are listed in the Scopus database. Only two from Serbia, for example. The situation is even worse with some countries in Africa, East Asia, and Latin America. And these results are not surprising, though, as they attest again to the process of unfolding academic colonialism. Second, I wanted to understand what areas on the global map attract stronger academic attention. To address this question, I mapped the data collected by parsing all these articles, 1663, to count frequencies of direct references to different countries. So the results of my mapping demonstrate that academic scholarship more often refers to cases of cultural diplomacy in the most powerful Western countries like the United States or UK. It also revealed that top countries that invite academic research on cultural diplomacy include China, Japan, and Russia. Specifically, four major countries such as the United States, UK, China, and Russia have always attracted a significant amount of attention from academics in exploring cases of cultural diplomacy across decades. The geography coverage is not, again, very surprising, considering that cultural diplomacy as a practice was born in the times of the Cold War that put in opposition two major ideological systems, such as capitalism, spearheaded by the United States and its close allies, such as the UK, and communism, promoted by Soviet Russia and China. The situation signals the need to address these geographical gaps in scholarship to develop a much more diverse picture covering different parts of the world. This becomes even more critical in the conditions when the geographical coverage of the majority of the countries from the global south, for example, is based on the analysis as predominantly target areas and subjects of cultural diplomacy activities of more powerful Western countries. This is a growing need to explore cultural diplomacy from new perspectives and trajectories, decolonizing the disciplines. In my presentation specifically, I would like to look and propose two approaches for this endeavor, such as taking the trajectory of non-Western diplomacy and indigenous diplomacy. So let's first look at indigenous diplomacy. In quantitative terms, my analysis revealed that among 1,663 publications listed by Scopus, only 9 articles, which is less than even 1% of the whole scholarship, are devoted to the topic of indigenous diplomacy. I also found a few books listed on the slide. However, these publications mostly deal with the advocacy on the more kind of recognitions on indigenous rights and legal issues around their claims to land and cultural heritage. While these important topics are also discussed outside of this narrow confine of diplomacy literature, these discourses do not go beyond the acknowledgement of the very existence of indigenous humanities, which I think is not enough. Moreover, the majority of the articles reveal the instrumental approach to indigenous arts, culture, heritage, and even current support of communities that is used and promoted by states as mere diplomatic tools to achieve their own foreign policy objectives on the global arena. A good example is an article by Huang, published in 2021, who exposed how Taiwan government mobilized its prehistoric Austronesian linguistic heritage and indigenous culture to reposition itself in the Asia Pacific by establishing these cross-border exchanges and partnership among indigenous communities in Taiwan. So the article reveals the extraterritorial role of indigenous heritage that can be strategically mobilized by the government as a tool of cultural diplomacy to strengthen a small and very much contested state's position in the wider region. So this and other similar cases from Australia, Asia, and Latin America expose the limitation of the current diplomatic scholarship discussing indigenous issues that are portrayed only as a resource or an instrument in larger geopolitics. They fail to clearly articulate and argue for the epistemic power of indigenous knowledge to enrich, expand, challenge, and provoke the diplomatic studies and practices. So the most recent move towards this important pivot in the indigenous trajectory is the article by Brisen and Jasep, which is called Towards a Critical Diplomacy, published most recently, I think in spring this year. It aims to radicalize the study of diplomacy by challenging the Eurocentric dualist constructions of nature and culture, and that only reproduce a Western episteme and deny other ways of knowing. Instead, the article discusses indigenous art diplomacy to give voice to this political consciousness that animates the indigenous practices of place-based internationalism. The other trajectory that I advocate for is non-Western cultural diplomacy. Cultural diplomacy has often relied on binary worldview with a clear distinction between the West and the rest. And it is important to challenge this notion, advocating for a more nuanced understanding and moving beyond this Eurocentric and American-centric perspectives that dominated the academic studies of diplomacy and really failed to acknowledge the richness and validity of knowledge systems from diverse regions. To move beyond the knowledge produced by white males with inherited biases, we need to encourage a multi-scholar perspective to examine the role of cultural exchange at the local levels, exploring the marginalized geographies where diplomacy can have really a profound impact. In my own research, I initiated this pivot for non-Western diplomacy epistemology with a special issue non-state diplomacy from non-Western perspectives, which was published in the Hague Journal of Diplomacy in 2019. And my special issue identified and acknowledged new actors in cultural diplomacy that would not fit a strict binary opposition of state or non-state established in the Western academic scholarship. So traditionally, governments have been primary drivers. They have been recognized as the more important actors of diplomacy, while non-state actors were recognized only in democratic context of Western countries with strong civil society. So that would give, a perception that in non-Western countries, there is no non-state actors of diplomacy. So focusing on China, Russia, and Turkey, known for their authoritarian governments, so far beyond, far from the democratic systems. My special issue, in fact, identified the agency of very powerful non-state actors who exist through very, very complicated networks and navigate a complex ecosystem of relationship where the governments are not necessarily the key custodians to orchestrate major cultural relations. So my work strongly advocates for fresh approaches to explore cultural diplomacy from the margins. And I invite you to read both the special issue and the article that is published in the open access. I hope that these critical trajectories will grow stronger in the future, exposing a wider myriad of ways to acknowledge and celebrate our global diversity. Let me finish here and thank you for your attention today. I would like to give the floor to other panelists on the panel now, and I wish you to have a very productive discussion in the end of the session. Please do outreach to me if you are interested in learning more about my research, and I'm very happy to continue the conversation beyond the conference.